Hello and welcome to the continuation of our month-long May the 4th Star Wars special. In this episode, I'm going to attempt to defend Star Wars the Phantom Menace against what I feel to be some of its less fair criticism. In truth, I quite enjoyed Star Wars the Phantom Menace, which I'm sure is much to the disgust of most of the internet. Wait, is that still the case, or is it now cool to like the prequels and hate Star Wars Episode 7? I have trouble keeping up with the lynch mobs. Whatever. Either way, I quite enjoyed the film. To start off with, we're going to have a look at one of the things that it gets criticized for the most. It's been insulted for this in most areas, including even The Simpsons. I am, of course, talking about the abundance of politics and political debate.
Now I can hear you asking, who in their right mind would enjoy political debate? Well, me for one. But past my nerdy enjoyment of politics, it was actually entirely necessary for the entire saga. In episode 4, we hear that the Imperial Senate has been dissolved permanently by the Emperor, and that the last of the Republic is now gone.
The Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
It is this Republic that we see in motion throughout the prequels, as it is slowly turned into nothing more than a puppetry of the Emperor. Palpatine's masterful manipulation of the government, which eventually allows him to rise to unchallenged power, is what makes him such an enjoyable bad guy. And further, and probably of more importance, it is the very Republic that we see debating here that the Rebel Alliance in Episode 4, 5, and 6 is fighting to reinstate. That is, of course, why the Rebel Alliance's full title is the Alliance to Restore the Republic. Without being shown a working democracy, Palpatine's rise to power, his manipulation of the Republic, and his final destruction of the Republic would have meant nothing. Therefore, as the Star Wars prequels were attempting to establish how the Star Wars universe had become what it was in Episode 4, I believe showing the Republic's corruption and downfall resulting in the Clone Wars and eventually the Empire and then the Rebel Alliance was done fantastically. You simply cannot adequately contrast a universe in which there's a democratic government working against one run by a dictatorship if you do not actually show that democratic government working at some points. Without seeing the Republic in action, seeing the Republic fall wouldn't have had anywhere near of an impact.
The second issue I see a lot of people taking up with Star Wars the Phantom Menace is midichlorians.
What are midichlorians?
Well, I'm glad you asked, little orphan Annie.
So what is midichlorians? Well, they're a scientific explanation for the Force. What that explanation is doesn't so much matter as the fact that there is one. Yes, I see you all clamoring to get your pitchforks, asking me why would you want to explain space wizards. It takes out the mystery, Grim. Well, it's precisely for that reason that I thought it was a good idea. What we have in the original trilogy is a scientific and cultural regression. The original trilogy is the Dark Ages. The Republic period is basically Star Wars' equivalent to the Roman Empire. We're shown palaces and beautiful gowns and unnecessarily decorated ships, and, well, a scientific understanding of the Force. In Star Wars Episode 2, we hear that the Republic has stood for 1,000 years, and while surely not all of that was completely peaceful, it has clearly been profitable at the very least for many of the planets involved. So let's have a look at it here. We have the sleek, beautiful designs of the Naboo starfighters. Now compare that to the Y-Wings or the X-Wings of the Rebel Alliance, or even the TIE Fighters of the Empire. Gone now are the unnecessary chrome coverings, left with nothing but what's required for the ship to fly and shoot. What we see in the Naboo starfighters is a form of pomp and pageantry that simply cannot be afforded by the Rebel Alliance and the Empire. In the prequels, but Episode 1 especially, we're shown a galaxy that has yet to go through the very expensive nature of the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War. However, far from costing money alone, the war has cost something else. Knowledge. And while I know there is a specific quote either in Star Wars Rebels or Star Wars Lost Stars, I'm honestly not sure which tells us that the Empire is controlling and censoring knowledge, it is fairly obvious that they would do so. They are, after all, space Nazis, and Nazis burnt books. The other important thing to note is that the knowledge of the Jedi is in the Jedi Temple, which is of course on Coruscant, which is of course what becomes the center of the Empire. In fact, I'm fairly certain that the Jedi Temple on Coruscant actually becomes the Imperial Palace. Hashtag citation needed. By the time of Episode 4, we have Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is one of the last of the Jedi, getting referred to as a crazy old wizard.
That wizard's just a crazy old man.
Therefore, I believe the midichlorians, and, well, the heightened technology throughout all of the prequels, and the way that it was all prettier and shinier, was a great way to show the regression that occurred once the Empire rose, and it was also a great way to illustrate the full extent of the Jedi's fall from grace. They were not just a group of religious warrior monks, they were actually also highly intelligent and educated, and they lost that just as they lost everything else when the Empire rose.
Now we're going to move on to something rather specific that I loved and was surprised to see a lot of people hated. That's right, folks, we're talking lightsaber fights.
I see a lot of people complaining that the lightsaber battles in the prequels are heavily choreographed, over the top, and look more like dances than fights. This is in comparison to the raw realism of the fight scenes in the original trilogy. Look at that fight. Such anger, such power.
And yes, while I'm aware I could take the easy road here and make fun of people that are looking for realism in a fight scene between two space wizards using laser swords, instead, I'm going to point out that the over-the-top nature of the fight scenes in Star Wars Episode 1, 2, and 3 is exactly the point.
Well, you remember just before I was talking about cultural regression. Well, I believe we have another case of that here. Just like in the real world, training in a form of martial arts is an art form. That's why it's called martial arts. And therefore, in the prequel trilogy, we see the Jedi doing all sorts of things that you never see in the original trilogy. They're doing flips and swings and jumps and all sorts of lovely things that we never see in the originals. And this is largely because the Jedi we're seeing in Episode 1, 2, and 3 have been training as Jedi their entire lives. I mean, Anakin was only, 10 years old, and the Council said he was too old to train, so obviously they start training Jedi very young. Compare this to Episode 4, where we see a battle between an old man who's done nothing but sit in a cave for 20 years, fighting a man who is now more machine than anything else. Granted, Vader is still very powerful with the Force, he clearly is not as good a swordsman as he used to be. I mean, by the time of the fight scene in Episode 6, where they are actually starting to have flips and whatnot in it, Luke still hasn't received as much training as probably a Padawan has. And once again, the Empire's rise to power would explain why this art form has been lost. The Jedi are dead, their temple in the hands of the Empire, and all that are left are old, tired war heroes. And by the way, this explanation extends to Episode 7, as Rey didn't receive any Jedi training and is just good with close-range weapons, and Kylo Ren was trained by Luke Skywalker, who he himself never received the proper Jedi Temple training. So it makes sense that the Jedis in the prequels are much better at doing over-the-top fight scenes than that of the Jedis in the original trilogy. But now you're probably asking, why would they want to be better at doing over-the-top fight scenes? Well, quite simply intimidation. It's freaking scary. I mean, honestly, look at the first time you see Darth Vader using a lightsaber in a battle versus the Duel of Fate scenes where Darth Maul is using his lightsaber. He's flipping around and stuff, and it's very, very frightening. If you were to totally ignore the Force powers that either of them possess, which would you rather fight, honestly? The Jedi, and in extension the Sith, would not by any means be the first civilization in history, and I'm talking real history, to import a kind of theater into their fights to make it more intimidating. If your enemy sees you fighting someone else and thinks, hell, that looks scary, they're less likely to fight you. So I'm 100% on board with the over-the-top, theatrical, choreographed fight scenes in the prequel trilogy. Let's be honest, they look badass.
One thing I absolutely loved about Star Wars The Phantom Menace, and that I don't think needs any defending because I think most people are pretty on board with, is the pod races. How cool are the pod races?
The pod races are just freaking badass. They're like Formula 1 races, except with hovercrafts that have jet engines tied to them. I don't need to say anything more, because you know that's awesome. Hey, wasn't that Aura Singh the bounty hunter from the Clone Wars series? I guess even she likes pod races. Also, now that I think of it while watching the pod racer scene, the graphics in this film actually hold up surprisingly well today. They look rather fantastic, and there's not many areas I can fault it on. I mean, of course Jar Jar looks a bit off, but it still doesn't look distractingly bad. It looks better than the speeder crash in Star Wars Episode 2, so I would have to say that the visual effects are a positive in this film, or, at the very least, not a negative.
And in the category of further things that were unquestionably awesome about Star Wars The Phantom Menace, we have Liam Neeson, Ewan McGregor, and Natalie Portman.
We also have several satisfying battles, droidicars, the Federation Army, the Gungan Army even, both of which look very cool, a very enjoyable space battle, and the list goes on.
All of that said, was Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace flawless? God no!
It has Jar Jar Binks, some seriously terrible pacing issues, completely out of the place attempts at comedy, and some really terrible, terrible acting. These are all indefensible flaws that the movie most clearly has. This is not an invitation to have a go at Jake Lloyd, by the way. He was just a kid. He wasn't the one that cast himself or directed himself poorly, so don't have a go at him. In fact, don't have a go at the guy that cast him or directed him either, because George Lucas already gets enough shit thrown his way.
But every film has its faults. No film is flawless. And all of these terrible things do not make a terrible movie. The terrible things in Star Wars The Phantom Menace pale in comparison to the awesome things.
Well, I'm sure I'll no doubt be accused of being a fanboy, which is honestly perhaps a fair cop. I don't think that I could ever be convinced that Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace is a terrible movie. The scene where the door opens revealing Darth Maul is still probably one of my favourite cinematic scenes ever. It began fleshing out Obi-Wan Kenobi and turned him into a really interesting character, and it gave us Qui-Gon Jinn, who was a badass. On top of this, it introduced the droid army, which brought along with it droidicars, which are just completely badass. And it also gave us pod racing, which was extremely badass, led to a great video game, and I've been wanting more of them since. Honestly, Disney, now that you're making more extended universe films, if you make an entire trilogy series about pod racing, I'd watch it. Or maybe turn it into a Netflix original series. Either way, give us more pod racing.
And for all of these reasons, I believe Star Wars The Phantom Menace is a pretty damn good sci-fi film. Could it have been better? Yes, of course. Was it the best Star Wars film ever? No, of course not. But I still think that it positively contributed to the Star Wars saga, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I have been and still am Grim Grindle, and you have been watching SciFi MineCart, a defense of Star Wars The Phantom Menace.